At 15 years old, Permelia Nash owned nothing but a flour sack of mended clothing, $4 silver sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and a stubborn streak she had inherited from a father 3 years in the ground. Her uncle by marriage, Wendell Prout, the man a county judge had once trusted to raise her, told her plainly one gray morning that a girl of working age was one mouth too many for his table, and he sent her out his door before the frost had even lifted from the fence posts. With the little she had, she did not buy bread, and she did not buy a room for the night. She walked straight to the courthouse steps of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming territory, and bid $14 on the old boarded-up telegraph office that nobody else wanted, a building the whole town called ruined and not worth the nails in its door. Everyone said it was a foolish purchase for a girl with no family left in the world. But bolted inside a rusted iron safe in the back room waited something Permelia could never have imagined, her own sister's name, written over and over, in a hand that had never once stopped searching for her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Permelia Nash. If this story of two sisters kept apart by hard circumstance but never by heart moves you, tell us in the comments which town you're watching from tonight. Larkspur Hollow sat in a shallow bowl of the Wyoming High Plains, ringed by pale bluffs and threaded by a creek that ran loud in April and thin as thread by August. It was not a large town, but it was a stubborn one, the kind of place that had decided, against the wind and the distance and the long winters, to stay put and call itself a community. And for 11 years, the beating heart of that decision had been a small frame building on the corner of Cedar and Front, where a patient, careful man named Silas Nash sat each day with a brass key beneath his fingers, tapping out the town's births and deaths and cattle prices to the wider world, and receiving in turn whatever news the wider world had thought Larkspur Hollow deserved to hear. He was the telegraph operator, and in a place with no newspaper of its own, that made him something close to a town historian, though he never once thought of himself that way. Permelia was the younger of his two daughters, born 4 years behind her sister Yoni, and the two girls grew up practically inside that little office, perched on apple crates behind the counter, listening to the clatter of the key the way other children listened to a mother humming while she worked. Their father used to say that a message carried carelessly was a message betrayed, and he meant it as more than instruction. He taught them patiently that the code itself had been built on a kind of fairness, that the letters a person used most often in ordinary speech, letters like E and T, were given the shortest, simplest taps, so that common words could travel quickly and not tire the hand or waste the line, while rarer letters carried longer, more deliberate patterns. It was, their father said, a small piece of everyday justice hidden inside a machine, and Permelia, young as she was, understood it as her first lesson in paying attention to things other people overlooked. Their mother, Risanna, kept the house above the office with a kind of unhurried competence that neighbors still spoke of years later. She was known along Front Street for her quilts, pieced from feed sacks and worn shirts and whatever scraps a hard winter left behind, and for a larder that never seemed to run as thin as anyone else's because she understood better than most how to make a single sack of dried beans, a smoked hawk, and a shelf of August's canned tomatoes and green beans stretch clear through to the first thaw. She dried chamomile and mint from the kitchen garden each summer, not as any cure for illness, but as a gentle comfort for a fretful child or a sleepless night, and she taught both her daughters to salt meat, to seal jars properly so the lids would not bulge with spoilage, and to mend a torn hem so fine the tear could hardly be found again. These were not lessons she called lessons. They were simply the shape of a day. Yoni was 4 years older, bold where Permelia was watchful, quick to speak her mind at the supper table, quick to defend her little sister from any boy at school who thought her too quiet to matter. It was Yoni who taught Permelia to braid her own hair when their mother's hands grew busy, Yoni who walked her the long way home past the mercantile so she could press her nose to the glass and admire the ribbon spools, Yoni who, on the coldest nights, would slide across the narrow bed they shared and warm her sister's feet between her own. Permelia, in turn, remembered everything. She remembered the exact rhythm of her father's key, the particular way he cleared his throat before a difficult message, the pattern of her mother's stitches, the sound of her sister's low. It was perhaps the family's quiet inheritance that Yoni gave courage outward into the world, and Permelia gathered the world inward and kept it safe. Sundays belonged to the small clapboard church at the edge of town, where the Nash family sat in the third pew from the front out of long habit rather than any particular piety, and where Risanna Nash was known to organize the quilting circle that met each month in the church hall, piecing together bedding for whichever family in the county had most recently lost a barn to fire or a season to drought. It was there, among the older women trading needles and news in equal measure, that Permelia first learned the unspoken economy of a frontier town, that no family truly stood alone, that a jar of preserves left quietly on a widow's step or a fence mended without being asked was its own kind of currency, one that could not be counted but was rarely forgotten. Silas kept a small flock of hens and a single milk cow behind the office, more for the household's own table than for any income, and he taught his daughters early that livestock wanted a steady hand and a fixed hour more than they wanted affection, that an animal fed at the same time each morning would trust a person long before it loved them, and that trust, once earned through simple consistency, was worth more on a hard winter day than any amount of coaxing. There was a family Bible on the mantel where births were recorded in Silas Nash's careful hand, and there was a brass telegraph key on the office counter that the girls had nicknamed, half in jest, the family's third voice, since it seemed to speak for their father even when he said nothing at all. Neither girl could have guessed, in those years of canning and quilting and code, how much they would one day give to hear that voice again, or how far apart the world would push them before it did. The fever came through Larkspur Hollow in the autumn Permelia turned 11, the kind of low, creeping sickness that moved house to house along the creek before anyone had a proper name for it. And it took both her parents within 11 days of each other, her father first, worn thin already from a summer of overwork, and her mother soon after, too exhausted from nursing him to fight it herself. The town buried them side by side in the cemetery above the bluffs, and for a short while, neighbors brought over baskets of bread and spoke gently to the two orphaned girls, the way people do when grief is fresh and visible. But baskets of bread do not raise children, and within the month, the county court had appointed a guardian to manage what little estate remained, a distant relation by marriage named Wendell Prout, a man who owned the town's largest freight operation and sat, not coincidentally, on the board of the Larkspur Hollow Trust Bank. Wendell Prout was not a cruel man in any way the law could measure, which made him, in some ways, harder to fight than a cruel one would have been. He was simply a man who saw an estate the way he saw a shipment of goods, as something to be sorted, valued, and disposed of at the most convenient price. He petitioned the court that the Nash family's small telegraph building and its equipment were, in his words, of little remaining worth, that the operator's post itself had already been reassigned to a younger man from Cheyenne, and that the estate's debts, real and inflated both, required the property be settled quickly. The court, trusting a respected banker over the interests of two children too young to speak for themselves, allowed it. The office was shuttered. The equipment, save for the old brass key too worn to interest a buyer, was sold off piece by piece. And the two sisters, in the practical calculation of a busy household, became more burden than blessing. Such arrangements were common enough across the territory in those years, a court-appointed guardian often finding it simpler and cheaper to place an orphaned girl in service to a tradeswoman than to raise her outright, the girl trading years of unpaid labor for room, board, and instruction in a trade she could one day call her own. It was not in the strictest sense unlawful, and a fair guardian might have chosen the arrangement with genuine care for the girl's future. Wendell Prout chose it, Permelia would later understand, chiefly because it settled one obligation quickly and left him answerable to no one for how the girl fared afterward. Leonie, 17 by then, was sent within the year to apprentice under a seamstress in Sweetwater Crossing, the kind of indenture that traded years of unpaid labor for room, board, and a trade at the end of it. She left with a single trunk and a promise, whispered fiercely to her little sister on the porch step, that she would write, that she would come back for her the moment she was able. Permelia, only 13, was kept on in the Prout household as unpaid help, minding younger cousins, scrubbing floors ending linens long after her fingers had grown numb with cold, and for 2 years she told herself that endurance was its own kind of loyalty to her parents' memory. But a household that resents a mouth will eventually find its reason to be rid of it, and when Permelia, at 15, dared to correct Wendell's own son in front of company for a careless lie, the excuse arrived within the week. She was, Wendell said, old enough now to make her own way. The door closed behind her before she had finished buttoning her coat. She did not go to the church, and she did not beg at any neighbor's table, though she might have been forgiven for either. Instead, she gathered what coin she had saved in 2 years of quiet, careful mending work done on the side, $4 silver in total, and she walked toward the one place in Larkspur Hollow that still, in some buried corner of her heart, felt like it belonged to her family. The old telegraph office had stood empty and boarded for years by then, its taxes long delinquent, its ownership tangled in county paperwork nobody had bothered to untangle, until the trustee's office finally posted it for public auction to recover what little was owed. On the courthouse steps that cold morning, with a scattering of townsfolk more curious than interested, Permelia raised her hand and bid $14, every coin she owned to her name on a building most called worthless. Nobody else bid against her. Nobody else wanted it. She walked away that afternoon the owner of a ruin, and she told herself firmly that it was shelter and nothing more, four walls and a roof that did not require a landlord's approval to sleep beneath. It took her 3 days of scrubbing to make the place fit for a person again, sweeping out mouse nests and dead leaves, scrubbing years of dust from the front counter, prying loose the boards nailed over the windows so that afternoon light could finally reach the floor for the first time in a decade. She scoured the small stove in the back room until it drew clean, aired the one straw mattress left behind by hanging it over the porch rail for a full day of wind, and swept the hearth of ash so old it had gone nearly white. There was a particular satisfaction. She found, in this kind of labor, the same satisfaction her mother had once taken in a jar sealed properly or a hem stitched so it would not fray. The quiet knowledge that a thing cared for with steady hands would answer that care back. Whether it was a garden, a milk cow, or a building the whole town had already given up for lost. And it was while she was clearing the counter, running a rag along its scarred surface, that her hand stopped over a small object bolted still to the wood, dulled with tarnish but unmistakable in its shape. A telegraph key. The same key she realized with a slow, disbelieving certainty that her father's hand had rested on 1,000 times, its brass worn smooth in exactly the places his fingers had always pressed. Whoever had cleared the office years before had taken the larger, sellable equipment and left this one small, worthless piece behind, never guessing that one day it would be the only inheritance Silas Nash's daughter would ever receive back from the county that had taken everything else. Permelia sat on the floor of that dusty office and wept for the first time since her uncle had shut the door behind her, not from grief alone, but from something closer to recognition, as though the building itself had been waiting to be claimed by the right hands. It was in the days that followed, as she worked to make the office livable, that she noticed the loose board beneath the back counter, a board that gave slightly under her boot where the others did not. Beneath it, set into the floor joists and hidden from any casual eye, sat a small iron safe, its door secured with a combination dial gone stiff with rust. She might have dismissed it entirely, another piece of abandoned junk left by whoever had cleared the building, except that scratched faintly into the underside of the counter, in a hand she recognized instantly as her father's own careful script, were 4 short lines of dots and dashes, the kind of private code a telegraph man might leave for no one but himself, or for a daughter who had once sat at his knee learning to read them. It took her the better part of 2 evenings, working by lamplight with a scrap of paper and her memory of her father's lessons, to translate the marks into numbers. Telegraph operators of the day often used a shorthand of numerals to stand in for whole common phrases, a habit born of the same economy that shaped the code itself, since a single figure sent down the wire cost far less than spelling a phrase out letter by letter, and children who grew up around a key often absorbed a few such numbers the way other children absorbed nursery rhymes. Her first guess was a date, her mother's birthday, then her father's, then the date of their wedding. Recorded in the family Bible, and each attempt left the dial unmoved and her patience thinner. It was only on the second evening, half asleep with her cheek nearly resting on the counter, that she remembered the private joke her father used to tap out just for her. A short numerical code he claimed stood for a nickname he alone had ever called her, something he'd taught her as a game long before she understood it might one day matter. When she finally turned the dial to match it, her hands trembling so badly she had to try twice, the door of the safe gave way with a groan of rusted hinges, and Permelia found herself staring into the one place in Larkspur Hollow her family's true history had been waiting, undisturbed, for nearly 4 years. Inside, bound with a strip of cracked leather, sat a thick bundle of telegraph flimsies, the thin yellow paper slips operators used to record incoming and outgoing messages, each one carefully dated, each one addressed the same way to any operator, any station, along the western lines. Permelia understood, even before she read the first word, that a person paid for a telegraph message by the word, which meant every unnecessary syllable cost real coin, and that whoever had sent these had chosen, again and again over the course of years, to spend hard-earned money on the same short, desperate plea, seeking information of Permelia Nash, formerly of Larkspur Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Any word gratefully received. And beneath each message, in a hand grown a little more tired with each passing year but never once wavering in its purpose, the same signature: Yoni Nash Cutter. She sat on the floor of that office for a long while, the flimsies spread across her lap like fallen leaves, and pieced together, message by message, the shape of the years she had lost. Her sister had married, it seemed, somewhere along the way, taken the name Cutter, and had likely been widowed or otherwise left on her own not long after. For the messages continued from town to town, Sweetwater Crossing, then Rock Springs, then places further still, as though Yoni herself had been moving in search of work and had simply carried her search for her sister along with her, telegraphing every operator in every town she passed through. Hoping some clerk somewhere might recognize the name and know where the youngest Nash girl had gone. It was, Permelia realized with an ache that settled somewhere beneath her ribs, exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous persistence their mother had shown in stretching a winter larder, and exactly the kind of stubborn loyalty their father had shown in every message he had ever carried faithfully down the line. Her sister had never stopped looking. She simply had never once thought to look inside the very building where the search might finally end. Tucked between two of the earliest flimsies, its edges soft with handling, Permelia found a small daguerreotype of two girls in matching pinafores, one perhaps 11 and the other 7, squinting into a borrowed camera outside the very office where she now sat. She recognized her own solemn child's face beside her sister's gap-toothed grin, and understood from the wear on the image's corners that Yoni must have carried it folded into every letter and every telegraph office she had passed through. A single small proof that the sister she searched for had once been real, and not merely a name on a court record. Permelia understood, too, something her father had once explained to her as a girl, that no single telegraph line ran the whole distance between two distant towns, that a message instead passed hand to hand along a chain of relay stations, each operator receiving the clicking pattern, writing it down, and sending it onward exactly as it had come, so that a single plea for a lost sister might pass through a dozen strangers' hands before it ever reached one who could answer it. It explained, in its own quiet way, why her sister's search had taken years rather than weeks, and why so many operators along that chain had simply logged the message and moved on, never guessing the name they copied belonged to a girl only a few counties away. Beneath the bundle of flimsies lay a second, more official document, and this one Permelia read twice to be certain she understood it correctly, for it changed the shape of everything Wendell Prout had ever told the court. It was the original deed to the telegraph office, and its small parcel of land, filed and recorded in her father's name alone, dated a full 2 years before his death. A deed that had never, in fact, been transferred or sold, because Silas Nash had quietly paid off the note on the property the year before the fever took him, wanting his daughters to have one thing in the world that could never be repossessed. Wendell Prout, it seemed, had either never known this or had chosen, in the confusion following the deaths, to petition the court claiming the estate insolvent and property nearly worthless, allowing its taxes to lapse rather than settle them from the estate funds he controlled, likely intending, in the fullness of time, to acquire the forfeited land himself through the trustee sale at a fraction of its worth, never imagining a 15-year-old girl with $4 silver would arrive at the courthouse steps before he did. Word of what Permelia had found did not stay quiet for long in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and it reached Wendell Prout within the week, delivered no doubt by one of the several clerks and depot men who owed him favors. He came to the office himself on a blustery afternoon, his coat still smelling of the bank, and told Permelia plainly that a girl of her age had no standing to hold property at all, that the county would surely see the sense in placing the building back under proper guardianship, meaning his own, and that she would do well to remember who had fed and sheltered her these past years before she went spreading tales that could embarrass a respected family. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply reminded her, in the calm tone of a man accustomed to being believed, that the word of a banker and trustee would always weigh heavier in a courtroom than the word of an orphaned girl with a rusted safe full of old paper. For a time, it seemed he might be right. The Larkspur Hollow Trust Bank quietly called in an old, forgotten lien against the property, a debt Wendell himself had let lapse years before but now claimed was still owed, and posted notice that the office might again face forfeiture within the month unless the sum was paid in full, a sum Permelia had no possible way to raise. Several townsfolk, unwilling to cross a man who held the note on half the businesses along Front Street, kept their distance, murmuring that it was a shame, but that a young girl playing at telegraph operator had always seemed a fanciful notion anyway. It was, Permelia understood in those difficult weeks, the same lesson her father's code had first taught her, that the things most easily overlooked, a worn brass key, a scratched-out message, a girl too quiet to be believed, were too often dismissed by people too busy or too comfortable to look closely. Even the mercantile owner, a kindly enough man on ordinary days, told her gently over the counter that she might do better to sell the building to Wendell for whatever he offered and take up honest work as a hired girl instead, since no bank in the territory would extend credit to a 15-year-old for repairs or supplies. And a telegraph office with no funds to keep its line in working order was, in his words, little more than a pretty notion. Permelia thanked him for his honesty and bought nothing that day, walking home past storefronts where a few neighbors nodded politely, and several others suddenly found something urgent to attend to across the street, the particular kind of small-town silence that speaks louder than any accusation. But not everyone in Larkspur Hollow had forgotten the Nash family so easily. An elderly widow named Adeline Vance, who had served for many years as the town's postmistress and had worked the counter beside Silas Nash more mornings than she could count, came to the office one evening with a shawl pulled tight against the wind and a small collection of her own old receiving books from the post office, still bearing her careful ledger entries alongside notations of telegraph deliveries she had helped route in the years before Wendell's clerk took over. She recognized Ioni's handwriting instantly on the flimsies Permelia showed her, having exchanged pleasantries with the girl 100 times as a child. And she recognized, too, the deed's filing date and seal as genuine county recording, not the kind of thing easily forged by a 15-year-old with no legal training. Adeline agreed, without hesitation, to speak on Permelia's behalf. And more than that, she carried word quietly to Judge Corwin Bly, a fair-minded man who had sat the county bench for 11 years and who remembered, as it happened, signing the very deed transfer himself back when Silas Nash had first paid off his note. The hearing that followed was a modest affair, held in the same small courthouse where Permelia had once raised her hand to bid $14, but it drew a fuller room than anyone expected, for word travels fast along a telegraph line and faster still along a town's back fences. Permelia wore her mother's good dark shawl and sat with the bundle of flimsies wrapped carefully in cloth on her lap, Adeline Vance seated close beside her with the old post office ledgers stacked like a small fortress between them. She watched Wendell Prout enter in his best coat, nodding to men he had done business with for years, entirely at ease in a room he had likely never expected to find himself defending anything in, and she felt, for the first time since her uncle had shut the door behind her, not fear of him but something closer to pity, that a man so used to being believed had never once thought to prepare an honest answer for the day someone finally asked him to give one. Judge Bly examined the deed, examined the county's original filing, and asked Wendell Prout directly why a debt he himself had allowed to lapse for years had suddenly become urgent the very week a fraudulent insolvency claim came into question. Wendell had no honest answer that satisfied the room, and Adeline Vance's steady, unshaken testimony, along with the plain evidence of the deed's true filing date, left little room for doubt. The judge ruled the original insolvency petition improperly filed, restored full and clear title of the office and its land to Permelia Nash's rightful heir, and ordered Wendell Prout to return from his own accounts the value of the equipment sold off years before, plus a fair penalty for the manufactured. It was not vengeance Permelia felt as she listened to the ruling, but something quieter and steadier. The simple relief of a truth finally allowed to stand in daylight after years spent locked in a rusted box. That same week, with her ownership no longer in question and her hands finally steady, Permelia did the one thing she had been longing to do since the moment she first read her sister's name. She reopened the telegraph line herself, relearning the key her father had left behind with patient, late-night practice, until her fingers found the old familiar rhythm again, almost as though no time had passed at all. She sent her message down the wire toward Rock Springs, the last town listed on Ioni's most recent flimsy, addressed simply to any operator there, asking after a seamstress named Ione Cutter, and she sat by the key long into the night, the way her father once had, waiting on an answer the wider world might or might not think Larkspur Hollow deserved to hear. The reply came 2 days later, relayed operator to operator down the line the same patient way news had always traveled to that little town, and it confirmed what Permelia had almost dared not hope, that a widow named Ione Cutter did indeed work in a dress shop on Rock Springs Main Street, that she had a small daughter of her own, and that she would be on the very next stage east, arriving within the week. When the coach finally rolled into Larkspur Hollow and Ione stepped down into the dusty street, older, thinner, her hands roughened by years of needlework but her eyes exactly as Permelia remembered them, the two sisters did not need a single word between them. Only the same fierce embrace they had shared as girls on a porch step 4 years apart in age and a lifetime apart in grief. A small girl of perhaps 4 peered shyly from behind Ione's skirts, clutching a rag doll, and Permelia knelt at once to introduce herself as an aunt the child had never known she had, feeling, as she did, the strange and tender sensation of a family growing wider again after so many years of only growing smaller. That evening, the three of them sat together at the small table behind the telegraph counter, sharing a supper of little more than beans and cornbread. And Permelia thought it the finest meal she had eaten since her mother's kitchen, not for anything on the plate, but for who sat around it. And so the girl who had stood at 15 with nothing but a flour sack and $4 silver became, within the same season, the rightful owner of her father's office, the keeper of her mother's quiet patience, and the sister who had finally been found. Permelia used a portion of the returned funds not for her own comfort alone, but to help two younger orphaned children in town whose situation too closely mirrored her own, paying their board with a kindly widow rather than let them fall into an arrangement like the one she had endured. The telegraph office reopened under the Nash name once more, its brass key restored to daily use, its safe emptied of old grief and refilled instead with the ordinary hopeful business of a working town, births announced, harvests reported, and from time to time, a message from a sister who now lived close enough to visit on a Sunday afternoon. Adeline Vance, whose loyalty had never wavered, took to stopping by most mornings with a basket of something warm and a spare pair of hands at the counter. And the same neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the question of Permelia's ownership now found reasons to linger by the window, admiring how quickly and steadily the youngest Nash girl had made the old place hum again. Even the quilting circle, hearing of all that had passed, gathered one more time that autumn to piece together a new bed cover for the office's back room, stitching into one corner block the initials of both sisters side by side, a small, deliberate echo of the family custom their mother had once kept, and a quiet promise, sewn in thread rather than telegraph cod. That the Nash name would not be so easily lost from Larkspur Hollow again. What Permelia had bought for 14 desperate dollars had never truly been a ruin at all. It had been the one place in the world still faithfully keeping her family's truth, waiting only for someone patient enough and worthy enough to come home and listen for it. Thank you for spending this quiet evening with Permelia Nash and the sister who never stopped searching for her. If her story moved you, we would be so grateful if you shared it with someone who understands what it means to hold on to family, even across long silence and hard distance, and please leave us a comment letting us know you were here. Before you go, we'd love to ask you something worth sitting with. Is there someone in your own family history, a name, a letter, an old keepsake whose story you wish you had asked more about while you still had the chance? Tell us in the comments below. Until our next story together, take care of yourselves and take care of the quiet histories carried inside the people you love.